Hey, this is Joe, Gray Bench Electronics. Welcome back to the Pedal Teardown series where I take apart new and interesting pedals and show you what's going on inside. Today we have a 2-for-1 special, the JHS Preamp and the JHS number 75 Throwback. Okay, Overdrive Preamp from JHS. So I'm going to do the sort of standard version of the pedal first, and then we're going to do the 75 Throwback version afterwards. If you want to skip ahead, go ahead, you won't hurt my feelings. All right, so Overdrive Preamp. So first off, I would recommend, if you haven't seen already, go check out JHS's video going over the creation or formulation of these pedals. They are based on a less known version of the DoD 250 that came before the 250, so it's not actually a 250, but it's the same circuit, which, if you don't know, is the same circuit as the MXR Distortion Plus. They go over a bunch of history of all of that. Essentially, they just talk about how that original pedal came first, and how that's actually V1, and then the gray spec is V2, blah, blah, blah. So this pedal is sort of the JHS mass-produced version of that earlier DoD 250, which is just called the Overdrive Preamp from DoD. So this version here, it's in the 1590 BBS size enclosure, so 1590 BB length and width, but the height it's taller, more space there. It's a black sort of textured paint finish with yellow silkscreen, Overdrive Preamp in the same sort of offset, thin and heavy font that is on the original DoD Overdrive Preamp pedal. Level and gain controls just like a DoD 250. There is a switch here that switches between two different diode configurations. One configuration is silicon diodes, just a symmetric clipping set up straight to ground. The other selection is a set of Schottky diodes with a current limiting resistor, tail resistor on the end of the diodes. We'll look at that when we're inside the PCB. Latching foot switch, 5mm red LED for indication. JHS pedals on the bottom. In and out jacks are side mounted, DC jack on top. On the back has the JHS sticker, power specifications, designed and built in Kansas City, Missouri. Let's go ahead and crack open the pedal. All right, so here is the PCB assembly for the mass-produced version of the Overdrive Preamp from the JHS. Two boards here connected with a 6-conductor ribbon cable. We have our blue, this is actually I call it the Gorva style, this is how I know it. It's just the sort of light blue or teal foot switch, and it has less pressure, less actuator pressure, and also supposed to have a longer lifespan, so it's not the heavier blue feel, it's a little bit lighter. PCB mounted 1/4" jacks are Neutrik stereo jacks. The potentiometers here are the 9mm alpha potentiometers. The gain control is a linear 250K, and the volume control is a linear 100K. Switch here to switch the diode configuration. This is based on the DoD 250, similar circuit or nearly identical circuit to the MXR Distortion Plus. So it's a single op-amp. In this case, it is, see the chip there is a surface mount Texas Instruments UA741C. Here are the clipping diodes. There are essentially two banks of diodes here, and they're arranged symmetrically. So one is going to have polarity pointing towards the single path. The other one's going to have polarity pointing towards the ground, which just means that as your waveform passes through, it's going to clip theoretically symmetrically for the entire waveform, at least as symmetric as the diodes are. The configuration here, like I said, there's two banks, so when the switch is in the up position, it connects one set of diodes to the signal path. In the other position for the switch, it connects the other bank of diodes. And you can see here, there's a small resistor, surface mount resistor there near these two diodes. These two are the Schottky diodes. The diode code is S7, which, after I looked it up, tells me that these are probably BAT42 surface mount diodes, Schottky diodes. The code on these diodes is T4, which apparently is the code for a 1N4148 surface mount diode. I believe the up position is the silicon diodes, so less clipping, louder output. Down position is the Schottky diodes with the current limiter, so that's going to be more clipping, less output. Other components here, we obviously have the pins for the DC jack, a little protection diode, probably a 5187 or similar. It's a series protection diode, so that's the common part number for that. Filter capacitor here is a 100 microfarad cap, and there's also a small little filter cap there, probably 100 nanofarad, and then small resistor here for the LED, and then the associated components, input and output caps. This large surface mount electrolytic is the output cap from the op amp. A couple resistors here to create the half supply voltage for the op amp for the bias. Flip over the board here. There aren't any components on this side. We just have some silkscreen information. The indication LED is connected down here, foot switch. The DC jacks are soldered on this side. Potentiometers, the switch. The silkscreen says JHS pedals, overdrive preamp, and David Orest Di Francesco was here. If you don't know David Orest Di Francesco, that is DOD, hence the name of the original company, DOD, David Orest Di Francesco. So that is the PCB for the mass-produced version of the overdrive preamp from JHS, clone of the unknown but now known V1 of the DOD 250. Let's put this back together and then we'll move on to the number 75 throwback. All right, this is the number 75 throwback version of the JHS Overdrive preamp, which is based on the DOD 250 version 1, what is now, I guess we'll consider the version 1. An earlier version of the DOD 250 before it was called that was just called the Overdrive preamp. If you haven't seen the JHS video going over that pedal and how it prompted the creation of these two versions, the JHS version, the more mass-produced version, and the number 75 throwback, which is only 250 units. Go check out that video. We're gonna take apart this one here. So with this pedal, they were going for a much closer copy to the original DOD pedals when they came out. Those ones, you'll see it in the video, but they say DOD, overdrive preamp. They don't say 250 on them. The circuit boards actually say 650, which is for a different pedal. The difference between these two versions here correspond to two different versions of the DOD overdrive preamp that Josh Scott has. The number 75 one has germanium clipping diodes. The other version of the overdrive preamp he has silicon diodes. So this one has two types of silicon diodes. One type though is Schottky diodes, which is similar to germanium. This pedal here is actually through-hole. It's all through-hole components, but also through-hole germanium diodes, which we'll see in a second. The enclosure here is very similar to the original enclosure DOD used. It is a folded steel enclosure. It has the same sort of black textured finish as the mass-produced pedal. They are serialized, and the construction here has this back panel that covers up the internals of the pedal. Controls-wise, we have gain and level, same setup here. 3mm indication LED. I don't believe the original DOD had an indication at all. At that point, they would have been using double pull, double throw foot switches, which then would not have left a switch for switching the LED on and off. Top mounted jacks, the DOD pedal I believe had side mounted jacks and 9-volt DC plug, which may have been, there may not have been a DC jack at all on the DOD pedal. If it was, it probably was 1/8 inch. On the back here, screws that hold on the rubber feet I watched the video and I saw that this was true to the DoD pedal. They had the screws that mount the rubber feet, and this is something that you can do. I don't particularly like this setup because the way this is designed, you're never going to get these folded steel doors to perfectly line up with the holes for the back panel, which means then that the screws kind of have to sometimes go in at an angle slightly, which they're just threaded into a lip of the enclosure here that has the possibility of stripping out a lot easier. In this case, this one, that doesn't line up, so you kind of want to push the edges in as it comes together. And what it also means is that you can't actually get a good fasten on these screws because you have the rubber of the foot switch between the screw head and the back panel metal. Some of these rubber feet have a metal washer embedded in the rubber, and there you can actually turn it and fully crank down on the screws. In this case, you wouldn't really want to crank down on these anyway because it's just screwing into sheet metal. But with this, you can't crank them too much because you'll just squeeze out the rubber. And what that means is that this back panel is kind of floating around because the screws aren't fully fastened. I don't blame JHS for doing this. It is true to the original pedal. The design sucked in 1974 and it still sucks right now. But it is true, and if you take care of it, it shouldn't be a problem. It's just, you know, if this is sitting on a pedal board and shifting around like this, you're putting stress on those screws in a way they weren't really designed to work. Also, it's very hard to get it level because the position of the rubber feet is dependent on the exact amount of turns you put into the screws. So anyway, tiny gripe. Let's go ahead and crack open the pedal. All right, so here is the inside of the number 75 throwback version of the Overdrive preamp from JHS. Can't actually get the PCB or PCBs out of the enclosure because the foot switch is going through the enclosure that way and the 1/4 inch jacks are going through that way. I've discussed it before with previous pedals, but anytime you have orthogonally mounted components, off-board components, I guess these are technically on-board, but components that poke through the enclosure, you have to have some consideration for getting those out. Usually what that means is putting the foot switch on its own board, but in this case we have the 1/4 inch jacks and the foot switch on the same PCB, which means they're essentially locked in there. The way this would have been assembled most likely is the 1/4 inch jacks would have been soldered to the PCB before installing. They would have slid that into the enclosure and then dropped the holes on top of the foot switch and then soldered the foot switch in. So now it's essentially locked into the pedal, which means we can't see the other side of the PCBs, but everything's here to see, so it's not that big a deal. It does make doing modifications more difficult, but this probably isn't the pedal you want to do mods to. The point is it's like a short run of pedals. So we have a piece of pick and peel foam here sitting in the little battery compartment. Plastic battery snap there. So you can run it on a 9-volt battery or with a 9-volt DC input. PCB itself is a nice black painted PCB with gold silk screen or some kind of gold. It actually looks like gold foil. Obviously not real gold, or maybe it is, who knows. Gold foil accents. The text here, it says Salt Lake City doesn't have any jazz. This says Overdrive Preamp Throwback, and down here it says David D. and John J. were here, kinda. So those are the two creators of DoD. And then it's 75. There are actually two PCBs in here. We have one PCB here holding the 1/4 inch jacks and the foot switch, as well as the LED. And there's a second PCB under there, which holds the circuit. And they're connected by this 6-conductor ribbon cable, just like the mass-produced pedal. As you can see, the circuit is all through hole in this case, where the mass-produced pedal is surface mount. Op amp, you can read there, is a National Semiconductor LM741CN. And that is a through-hole dip package. They go over into that video, but the DoD 250 has used a bunch of different op amps over the years. The 741 is the most famous, but it's also used the LF351, probably the LF353, TLO72, TLO80, one of the 8 ones, I think. The truth is that the op amp makes up very little of the sound of the pedal, and it's much more to do with the resistors and capacitor values of floating around it. But this has the 741, which is the correct, quote unquote, correct op amp for the DoD 250, or in this case, the Overdrive Preamp. Here are the two germanium diodes. These are Russian diodes. I believe they're Russian diodes. They are marked with a red and a blue band. I've seen those floating around on eBay marked as D9Es. D9E, of course, those are not actually the letters D and E, they're Cyrillic characters. Let's do a forward voltage test on those diodes and see what they come up. All right, so that is reading a forward voltage of 0.489 volts, and that's at 5 milliamps. It's of course, it's reading as a Zener diode because we have symmetric diodes, so it's reading the opposite diode as the Zener voltage. So that's actually what's showing here is VR, reverse voltage, or Zener voltage, is 0.489 volts, and forward voltage is 0.443. So one of the diodes has a little bit lower forward voltage. That may seem like sort of high forward voltage for germanium diodes, but that's most likely because you're used to seeing forward voltages for diodes at 1 milliamp, which is the standard testing voltage for like multimeters. The DCA Pro here tests at 5 milliamps, and so you're going to see higher forward voltages for germanium diodes with this specific tester than you will with like a multimeter. So they're definitely germanium diodes, and I do believe they are Russian D9E germaniums. Which makes sense for a project like this because you can still get those germaniums in high enough quantities to do a run of 250 pedals. So that makes sense. Of course, JHS explains in that video that at this point, DoD was building these pedals just with salvage parts from radios and computer PC cards, really whatever they could find. And at that point, you know, germanium diodes were as common as silicon diodes are today. So the original Overdrive Preamp definitely would not have had Soviet D9E diodes. It would have had some modern 1N34A or 1N270, something like that. Something domestically made. Any other details? The foot switch is the kind of teal Gorva style foot switch with the lighter pressure. The 1/4 inch jacks are stereo jacks. I don't see any manufacturer mark on them. Probably Neutrik or Amphenol. PCB mounted DC jack, obviously. The one thing I do want to test is, they wrote it somewhere, it was in the video, somewhere I saw them say, is that the volume pot is wired strangely. And in sonic tests, I concur with that. The volume control doesn't do much after the first 30% of the sweep. So my guess is that it's wired like a variable resistor as opposed to an actual potentiometer. So to test for that, we can try and see if two of the lugs of the potentiometer are jumpered together. Ah, okay, I see. So what it actually is the volume pot is sort of in reverse. It's not wired as a variable resistor, it is a potentiometer, but the circuit is moving into the pot on the wiper, and then the one side of the potentiometer is connected to ground, obviously, and then the other leg or end of the potentiometer, that is going to the output jack. And so it's just backwards. Usually we wire the circuit into one side of the potentiometer, we wire the other side to ground, and then the wiper is the output going to the output jack. I don't think that really makes a difference to the output of the pedal. I could be wrong about that. I've definitely seen other pedals wired that way. And so my observation of the volume control not working much is probably just a value for the potentiometer that is high enough that the sweep just doesn't matter much. All right, so that is the internals, PCB assembly components of the number 75 throwback version of the JHS Overdrive Preamp, which is a copy of the DoD Overdrive Preamp, which is the predecessor to the DoD 250. Ugh. So let's go ahead and put the pedal back together. All right, that wraps up the teardown of the JHS Overdrive Preamp and the number 75 Throwback. If you have any questions or recommendations for a pedal you want to see on a future teardown episode, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate you hitting the like button and subscribing, and hit the notification bell if you want to know when I make a new video. I am Joe from Great Bench Electronics. Thank you for watching.